have been listening to live Supreme Court arguments over the authority to impose tariffs, whether President Trump has that, to impose sweeping tariffs without Congress's approval. Now, what he has been using is a national emergency law to do so. It's the linchpin of his economic agenda, these tariffs. Now, based on what we've heard, the outlook doesn't seem to be all that great for the president, who earlier this morning.
Okay, so we need to talk about what's actually happening in the courts right now, because Trump is getting absolutely demolished by judges at every single level of the court system. This is not a drill. This is not exaggeration. Trump is facing a legal tsunami that's threatening to completely undermine his presidency and his administration's ability to do literally anything. A federal judge just ruled that his attempt to suspend SNAP funding was completely unlawful, and the courts ordered that the benefits continue anyway, which means Trump lost and lost hard on one of his major policy initiatives. And that's just one of many court defeats that have piled up in recent weeks and months. The Supreme Court refused to help him end birthright citizenship. Appeals courts are allowing investigations into his deportation policies to continue, and legal setbacks are accumulating faster than he can even respond to them. This is the kind of moment where people are starting to seriously talk about whether Trump can even continue as president, given all these legal constraints and defeats that keep stacking up against him. Come on, are you kidding me? The narrative is shifting from Trump being a strong executive to Trump being a president who can't actually govern because the courts keep blocking everything he tries to do. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's the absolute insanity of the situation we're watching unfold right now in real time. Trump came into his second term promising to completely reshape American government and implement his vision without any constraints or opposition. He was going to control the border. He was going to cut welfare programs. He was going to end birthright citizenship. He was going to push through his entire agenda without any pushback or legal challenges. But instead, every single major policy initiative he's tried to implement has run into courts that are saying, no, you can't do that. That violates the law and the Constitution. The judges are not having it, and they're not backing down, and they're not letting Trump do whatever he wants. This is wild because Trump thought his second term would be different, that he would have more power, that he would have fewer constraints. Instead, he's got more legal problems than ever before, and the courts are actively preventing him from implementing his policies. The SNAP funding ruling is just the tip of the iceberg here. We're talking about a federal judge looking at Trump's attempt to cut off food assistance to millions of people and saying that it's unlawful and that the benefits have to continue. That's a complete rejection of Trump's policy, and it's a signal that the courts are not going to let him govern by executive power alone without legal limitations. The birthright citizenship situation is maybe even more significant because it shows Trump trying to fundamentally change the Constitution itself through executive power. He wanted to end birthright citizenship, which means he wanted to say that babies born to non-citizen parents in the United States wouldn't automatically be American citizens. You know, this is a massive constitutional change that would affect millions of people and would require a constitutional amendment to actually accomplish. But Trump tried to do it through an executive order, and the Supreme Court just ignored his case and refused to act. That's basically the Supreme Court saying, we're not even going to entertain this argument because it's so clearly unconstitutional. This is the kind of humiliation that a president doesn't want to face, and it shows that even Trump's allies in the courts aren't willing to back his most extreme policies. The deportation policy investigations are also crushing because they're showing that officials in Trump's administration might be in contempt of court. That means judges are saying that Trump's people violated court orders, and they're investigating whether they should face legal consequences for that. This is serious stuff that could lead to criminal charges against Trump's own officials. What's really driving me crazy about all of this is the narrative that's emerging from the courts. The narrative is that Trump is a president who tries to govern illegally and unconstitutionally. He tries to take actions that violate the law. He tries to push policies that go against the Constitution, and the courts keep having to step in and stop him and tell him, no, you can't do that. This narrative is devastating for Trump because it makes him look like he's not respecting the rule of law and the Constitution. It makes him look like he's trying to be a dictator who wants to do whatever he wants, without any legal constraints. And this is the kind of narrative that sticks with voters.
We begin today with bracing warnings about Donald Trump's assault on constitutional limits and a sitting Supreme Court justice making a rare public statement about the impact on the judiciary. Without directly naming Trump, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson appeared to denounce the administration's repeated attacks on judges. As she put it to an audience of sitting federal judges and lawyers last night, Jackson said, quote, "The attacks are not random. They seem designed to intimidate those of us who serve in this critical capacity, and they ultimately risk undermining our Constitution and the rule of law."
And that shapes how people think about a president. If people start to believe that Trump is trying to govern illegally and that he's being stopped by the courts from doing illegal things, then his approval ratings go down, his credibility goes down, and his ability to push his agenda forward gets severely damaged. This is the worst possible narrative for a president to be dealing with during the early part of his term. And here's the thing that really shows how serious this situation has become. People are actually starting to talk about whether Trump should step down or whether he could be forced to step down by the courts. This is not something you hear in normal political discourse unless things have gotten really, really bad for a president. When judges are blocking your policies at every turn, when the Supreme Court is refusing to help you, when your own officials might be facing criminal charges for violating court orders, that's when people start asking whether a president can actually continue governing. This is the kind of moment that defines whether a presidency can survive or whether it's going to collapse under the weight of legal pressure and defeat. Trump is facing an existential threat to his presidency right now, and it's coming from the courts, not from Congress or from public opinion. The courts are systematically dismantling his ability to govern through executive power, and there's not much he can do about it because he has to obey court orders or he faces his own legal consequences. This is a nightmare scenario for any president, and it's happening to Trump right now in real time. All right, so let's dig deeper into exactly what these court rulings mean and why they're so devastating for Trump's presidency and his entire political future. The SNAP funding ruling is probably the most straightforward and easiest to understand, so let's start there with the actual details of what happened. Trump's administration tried to suspend SNAP benefits, which is the food assistance program that helps millions of low-income Americans buy food and feed their families. The Trump administration wanted to cut this program or reduce it or make it harder to qualify for, and they tried to do this through executive action. But a federal judge looked at this and said, no, this is unlawful, this violates the law, and you have to continue providing these benefits. The judge ordered the continuation of SNAP benefits, which means Trump's policy initiative completely failed. This is significant because it shows that even on domestic policy issues where the president normally has a lot of power, the courts will step in and block actions they believe are illegal. Trump thought he could just cut off welfare programs through executive power, but the court said, no, you have to follow the law, and the law requires these benefits to continue. What's important to understand about this ruling is that it's not just about SNAP benefits. It's about the principle of executive authority and what a president can actually do legally. When a judge says that Trump's action is unlawful, that judge is saying that Trump violated existing law in trying to suspend these benefits. That means Trump's lawyers didn't do their job properly, or Trump pushed too hard and overstepped what the law actually allows. This is embarrassing for Trump because he's supposed to have the best lawyers and the best administration. But he's constantly doing things that turn out to be illegal when the courts review them. It's like he's not paying attention to what the law actually says, or he doesn't care about the law, or he's just pushing through whatever policies he wants and assuming that the courts will back him up. And when the courts don't back him up, he just gets defeated and looks bad. This feeds into the narrative that Trump doesn't respect the rule of law, and that's a narrative that damages him politically. The birthright citizenship situation is actually even more serious and important because it goes to the heart of constitutional authority and the limits of presidential power. Birthright citizenship is the constitutional principle that anyone born in the United States becomes a citizen automatically, regardless of whether their parents are citizens or immigrants. This principle is based on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed after the Civil War. Trump wanted to end this through an executive order, which is basically saying that Trump thought he could change the Constitution through an executive order without going through the formal constitutional amendment process. This is absolutely wild and shows how far Trump is willing to push the boundaries of presidential authority. But the Supreme Court refused to even act on the case, which means the Supreme Court was basically saying that this is such a clearly unconstitutional request that we're not even going to entertain it. The Supreme Court could have sided with Trump, but it didn't. It could have heard the case and deliberated on it, but it refused. This is a massive rebuke to Trump and a signal that even the highest court in the land is not willing to go along with his most extreme constitutional interpretations. Now let's talk about the deportation policy investigations, because this is where things get really serious and criminal. Appeals courts have been allowing ongoing investigations into Trump administration officials for contempt of court regarding deportation policies. This means that judges gave orders about how deportation policies should be implemented, and Trump officials allegedly violated those orders. Contempt of court is a serious legal violation that can result in fines and jail time for government officials. If Trump officials violated court orders about deportation, that could mean they're facing criminal prosecution. This is not just about policy disagreements. This is about whether Trump administration officials broke the law and violated court orders. If this investigation leads to criminal charges, that's a massive scandal for Trump, because it shows that his own people are breaking the law. And if Trump tries to protect them or pardons them before the investigations are complete, that's going to look like obstruction of justice and like Trump is protecting people who broke the law. Here's what's really significant about all of these rulings taken together. They show a consistent pattern of courts rejecting Trump's attempts to use executive power in ways that the courts believe are illegal or unconstitutional. It's not one judge or one court system that's opposing Trump. It's judges across the country, it's appeals courts, it's the Supreme Court itself. Every level of the court system is basically saying no to Trump's policies. This creates a situation where Trump cannot actually implement his agenda because the courts keep blocking it. He can't cut SNAP benefits because the courts say that's illegal. He can't end birthright citizenship because the courts say that's unconstitutional. He can't implement deportation policies the way he wants to because courts are investigating whether those policies violate court orders. At what point does Trump have any ability left to actually govern? At what point does his presidency just become completely hamstrung by court orders and legal defeats? This is the question that people are starting to ask, and it's a serious question that threatens the viability of Trump's entire presidency. The timeline of these defeats is also significant because it shows an acceleration of problems. The SNAP ruling came in October, the appeals court decisions came in November, the Supreme Court action on birthright citizenship came in late November. This is not spread out over months or years. This is all happening in a compressed time frame, which means the pressure and the defeats are piling up faster and faster. Trump is facing a barrage of legal defeats that are accumulating and creating a sense that his presidency is crumbling in real time. This is the kind of momentum that can shift public opinion rapidly, because people start to see a president who's losing in the courts constantly and who's not able to implement his policies. The narrative becomes that Trump is a president who wanted to govern in a certain way but found that the courts won't let him, and now his presidency is constrained and limited and unable to move forward. This narrative is devastating because it makes voters question whether Trump can actually be an effective president if he's constantly being stopped by the courts. What's really important to understand is that these court rulings are not just legal defeats. They're political defeats that damage Trump's credibility and his power. When judges rule against you, it sends a signal to the rest of the government that you don't have the authority to do what you're trying to do. It sends a signal to Congress that you're overstepping your authority. It sends a signal to the bureaucracy that they don't have to comply with your executive orders because those orders are illegal. And it sends a signal to the public that you're trying to do things that violate the law and the Constitution. All of these signals combined undermine Trump's position as president and make it harder for him to govern. This is why the court defeats matter so much beyond just the specific policies that are being blocked. The defeats matter because they damage Trump's overall authority and power as president, and they create a situation where his entire presidency becomes increasingly constrained and limited. Okay, so let's break down the core implications of all these court rulings and what they actually mean for Trump's presidency going forward in the coming months and years. The first and most obvious point is that Trump is losing in the courts consistently and repeatedly. And this is a huge problem for his ability to govern. When a president is constantly losing in court, that president's power gets severely weakened. Executive orders get blocked, policies get reversed, and the president's ability to implement his vision gets completely constrained. Trump thought his second term would be different because he would appoint judges who would back him up, but instead, he's finding that courts across the country are still blocking his actions. This is wild because it shows that the judicial system is still functioning as a check on executive power, even when a president tries to appoint judges who would support him. The courts are rejecting his most extreme policies, and that's a sign that the Constitution and the rule of law are still holding, even under intense pressure from a president trying to push boundaries. The second key point here is that Trump is facing a serious legitimacy crisis because of all these court defeats. When judges keep saying that Trump is trying to govern illegally or unconstitutionally, that damages Trump's credibility and his moral authority as president. People start to question whether Trump respects the law and the Constitution, or whether he's trying to be a dictator who just wants to do whatever he wants. This is the worst kind of narrative for a president to be dealing with because it attacks the fundamental legitimacy of his presidency. If people believe that Trump is trying to govern illegally, then they're less likely to support him, less likely to vote for his party, and more likely to want him removed from office. This is existential for Trump because it goes to the core question of whether he has the moral and legal authority to be president. And right now, given all these court defeats, that question is becoming harder and harder to answer in Trump's favor. Now let's talk about the specific policies that are being blocked, because that matters too for understanding what's actually happening. Trump wanted to cut SNAP benefits, and the court said no. Trump wanted to end birthright citizenship, and the court said no. Trump wanted to implement deportation policies in a certain way, and the courts are investigating whether those policies violated court orders. So what Trump policies are actually going to succeed when the courts keep blocking everything? This is the fundamental problem that Trump is facing. He can't implement his agenda because the courts won't let him. A president without the ability to implement his agenda is basically a powerless president. And that's what Trump is becoming. He can't govern, he can't push through his policies, he can't achieve his vision because the courts are standing in the way. And there's not much Trump can do about it because he has to obey court orders or face his own legal consequences. This is a trap that Trump created for himself by trying to push policies that overreach presidential authority. Here's what comes next and what you need to understand about the future trajectory of Trump's presidency. If these court defeats continue and accelerate, there's going to be growing political pressure on Trump to either change his approach or step down. The talk about Trump stepping down is not random. It's coming from people who are looking at all these court defeats and asking themselves how much longer Trump can actually serve as president if he can't implement any of his policies. If Trump loses in court on every major policy initiative, his presidency becomes purely symbolic and ceremonial with no real power to govern. At that point, people might start asking why he should even remain in office. This is the trajectory that Trump could be heading down if the court defeats continue and get worse. It's not inevitable, but it's a real possibility that people are starting to take seriously. What's really critical to understand is that Trump might try to escalate the confrontation with the courts to try to regain power and authority. He might try to remove judges. He might try to pardon his officials who are facing contempt of court charges. He might try to defy court orders and risk his own legal consequences. Any of these moves would be extremely dangerous and would create a constitutional crisis. But Trump is the kind of person who might try them if he feels cornered and if he thinks it's his only option to save his presidency. This is where we're potentially heading, toward a showdown between Trump and the courts over the fundamental question of who has authority in the American government. This is not normal politics. This is a potential constitutional crisis where the courts are trying to enforce the rule of law, and Trump is trying to exercise power beyond what the courts believe is legal. But here's the thing that's important to understand. Even if Trump tries to escalate and defy the courts, he can't actually win that battle in the long term. The courts have power because they enforce the law, and they can enforce it against Trump just like they enforce it against anyone else. If Trump defies court orders, he becomes a lawbreaker himself. If Trump tries to remove judges, he's attacking the judicial branch and destabilizing the entire government. If Trump tries to pardon people who are facing charges, he's admitting that his administration is breaking the law. All of these moves would damage Trump politically and would accelerate the narrative that he's trying to govern illegally. This is why the court defeats are so significant. They create a situation where Trump cannot win because any action he takes to try to overcome the defeats will only make things worse politically. So what's the actual bottom line here that you need to take away from all of this? Trump is facing a legal and political crisis that threatens the viability of his entire presidency. The courts are systematically blocking his policies. His officials might face criminal charges for violating court orders. The narrative is shifting to one where Trump is a president who tries to govern illegally and is being stopped by the courts. And if this trajectory continues, people are going to start seriously discussing whether Trump should step down or whether his presidency has become so constrained and limited that it's basically not functional anymore. These are serious times, and Trump's presidency hangs in the balance. The next few months are absolutely critical because if Trump can't find a way to work with the courts and implement policies that pass legal scrutiny, his presidency might not survive the political and legal pressure that's building up against him. This is the moment where Trump's presidency either adapts and continues or collapses under the weight of court defeats and legal constraints. And based on what we're seeing right now, it's looking like Trump's presidency might be heading toward a serious crisis that could reshape American politics in ways we haven't seen in decades.